CPS knocked on my door and told me my son touched his 6-year-old stepsister. The woman from CPS had this practiced sympathy on her face, like she'd delivered this exact nightmare to 100 other families. Behind her stood 2 police officers, their hands resting on their belts. "We've received a serious allegation," she said, holding up her badge. "Your son Caleb has been accused of inappropriate contact with Gigi." My knees almost buckled. There's no way. When is this supposed to have happened? Last Tuesday evening. Gigi disclosed specific details to her teacher during a safety lesson today. She said it happened while you and your wife were at dinner. Tuesday, our anniversary dinner. Caleb had babysat Gigi for 3 hours. My mind was racing, trying to process what she was saying, but nothing made sense. Caleb was 17, heading to college next year, the kid who still watched cartoons with his stepsister on Saturday mornings. "We need to speak with Caleb immediately," the CPS worker continued. "And I'm afraid he'll need to come with us for a 48-hour emergency removal while we investigate." That's when my wife Laura came running down the stairs. She must have heard the commotion. "What's happening? Why are there police here?" The CPS worker repeated everything, and I watched my wife's face transform. She grabbed the doorframe like she might collapse, then her expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. "Where's Gigi? I need to see Gigi. She's safe at school with a counselor. We'll arrange for you to pick her up shortly." Laura pushed past me and screamed up the stairs, "Caleb! Get down here now!" Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajama pants and an old band t-shirt, his hair sticking up from sleep. He saw the officers and froze. "Dad? What's going on?" The next hour was a blur of horror. The officers searched Caleb's room while he sat on the couch, tears streaming down his face, saying over and over that he didn't understand. Laura wouldn't let him near her, wouldn't even look at him. She kept saying, Gigi wouldn't lie about this. She wouldn't make this up. The CPS worker interviewed Caleb right there in our living room. He was sobbing so hard he could barely speak. Yes, he'd watched Gigi Tuesday night. They'd played video games. He made her mac and cheese. She went to bed at 8:30. That was it. That was all. But Gigi had told her teacher details. She said he told her it was a special secret game that she couldn't tell anyone about. The officers cuffed my 17-year-old son in our living room while Laura held herself and rocked back and forth. Caleb looked at me with pure terror in his eyes. "Dad, I swear I didn't touch her. You have to believe me." I wanted to believe him. Every fiber of my being wanted to believe him. But Gigi was 6. Why would a 6-year-old make up something so specific? After they took Caleb away, Laura and I drove separately to pick up Gigi from school. When I saw her in the counselor's office, my heart shattered. She looked so small, wouldn't make eye contact with anyone, kept walking with a limp. The counselor said Gigi had been very brave. That disclosure was an important first step. Laura scooped Gigi into her arms and carried her to the car. I tried to follow, but Laura turned on me. "Don't. I can't even look at you right now. Your son did this." "Laura, we don't know. She has bruises. The nurse found bruises on her thighs." Laura's voice broke. "I need to take her to the hospital for an exam. Don't follow us." I stood in that school parking lot for 20 minutes, unable to move. My son was sitting in juvenile detention. My stepdaughter was headed for an assault kit exam. My wife blamed me. How had my family imploded in a single morning? That evening, Laura came home around 9 with Gigi asleep in her arms. She'd been prescribed a mild sedative to help her sleep. Laura carried her upstairs without a word, then came back down with a suitcase. "We're going to my mother's." "Laura, please. We need to talk about this." "Talk about what?" "Your son touched my daughter. The exam showed trauma." She gave detailed disclosure. "What is there to talk about?" "He's saying he didn't do it." Caleb has never lied to me about anything important. Laura laughed, but it was bitter and sharp. "They all say they didn't do it. Every single predator claims innocence." She pulled out her phone and showed me something she'd been researching. "See? Only 2% of children lie about abuse. So either Gigi is in that tiny minority, or your son is exactly what the evidence says he is." She left with Gigi that night. The house felt like a tomb. Something made me remember our nanny cam system. Laura had given investigators our security footage, but there was an old tablet still logged into the cloud backup. Then I found it. 2 weeks before the accusation. Laura sat with Gigi while Caleb was at basketball practice. "Remember what we practiced, sweetie?" Laura's voice was clear on the recording. "When the nice lady asks you, you tell her Caleb touched you here." Gigi's tiny voice responded, "But Caleb didn't do that. It's just pretend, like when we play house." I ran to the bathroom and threw up. My wife had coached her. That's when I heard the doorbell ring. "I know you're in there." It was Laura. I backed away from the door, my phone screen still glowing with that video of Laura coaching Gigi. Laura pounded harder, the doorbell ringing over and over. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. If I opened that door, she would know I found something. She would grab my phone, delete the files, destroy the only proof that could save Caleb. I ran to the kitchen and locked the back door too. then checked every window on the first floor. Laura's voice got louder outside, yelling my name now, demanding I let her in. I ignored her and pulled up Google on my phone, typing with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Criminal defense attorney, false accusations, emergency help. The first result was Lucas Ingram, a lawyer whose website said he specialized in wrongful accusations. It was almost 11 at night, but I called anyway. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and I thought it would go to voicemail. On the 4th ring, a man answered. His voice was tired but alert. I started talking fast, words tumbling out about Caleb, the accusations, the video I just found of Laura coaching Gigi. Lucas stopped me. He told me to slow down, take a breath, and send him the video right now. I pulled the phone away from my ear, found the video file in the cloud app, and hit share. Lucas stayed on the line while I did it. He told me not to open the door for Laura, not to talk to her, not to let her in the house under any circumstances. He said he would call me back in 20 minutes after watching the footage. I hung up and stood in my kitchen listening to Laura scream outside. She was threatening to call the police, saying I was keeping her from her things, that she had every right to be in this house. But her voice sounded different now, higher and more desperate, like she knew something had changed. After about 10 minutes, the yelling stopped. I crept to the front window and peeked through the curtains. Her car was still in the driveway, but I couldn't see her. Maybe she was sitting in the car, maybe she left to get help. I didn't know. My phone rang exactly 19 minutes after I sent the video. Lucas said 3 words first. This changes everything. Then he told me the video was clear evidence of coaching, that it could prove Caleb's innocence, but I needed to act fast. Laura would think to delete the cloud footage once she realized I had access. I needed to download every single file from every camera, save it to a hard drive, email it to myself, back it up everywhere possible. Lucas stayed on the phone while I worked. I grabbed my laptop and logged into the cloud system. There were 6 cameras in our house, and the system kept 30 days of footage. I started downloading everything, file after file, watching the progress bars crawl across my screen. Laura's pounding started again at the front door, harder now, more frantic. She was screaming that she knew what I was doing, that I better not touch those files. That confirmed it. She knew exactly what was on those cameras. The downloads took forever, almost an hour. Lucas told me to stay on the phone with him the whole time, to keep downloading even if Laura broke a window or called the cops. Around midnight, her pounding finally stopped for good. I heard her car start and watched through the window as she backed out of the driveway fast, tires squealing. The downloads finished at 12:45. I had every file saved in 3 different places. Lucas called me back at 1 in the morning. His voice was different now, more focused, like he had shifted into lawyer mode. He explained that while the video was powerful evidence, we had to be careful how we used it. Laura's attorney would claim it was edited, taken out of context, that I manipulated the footage to frame her. We needed a strategy. Lucas said he was already drafting an emergency motion to present to the judge at Caleb's detention hearing tomorrow afternoon. The motion would include the coaching video and request an immediate halt to proceedings pending investigation. He told me to try to get some sleep, but I knew that wasn't happening. After hanging up with Lucas, I opened the cloud app again and started watching footage from the past month. I watched every single video at double speed, looking for anything else that seemed wrong. Around 3 in the morning, I found the first one. Laura sitting with Gigi at the kitchen table 2 weeks ago, asking her questions about Caleb in this weird, careful way. Did Caleb ever ask you to keep secrets? Does Caleb ever touch you when Daddy isn't looking? The questions felt designed to plant ideas in Gigi's head. I kept watching. At 4:30, I found another clip from 3 weeks back. Laura and Gigi in the living room. Laura asking if Gigi knew what private parts were, if anyone had ever touched hers. Gigi said no, and Laura's face got this strange expression, like she was disappointed. The third clip was from almost a month ago. Laura practicing with Gigi how to talk to grown-ups about touching, using this calm, patient voice like she was teaching Gigi her ABCs. By 6 in the morning, I had 3 more videos showing Laura systematically coaching her daughter. The sun came up, and I was still sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by laptops and phones and backup drives. I hadn't slept at all. My eyes burned and my head pounded, but I couldn't stop. Every video was another piece of proof that my wife had destroyed my son's life on purpose. Lucas texted me at 7:30 to meet him at the courthouse at 9. He was bringing another attorney named Brittany Parks, who handled family law. I showed up early, standing in the courthouse parking lot with a folder full of printed screenshots and a thumb drive with all the videos. Lucas arrived right at 9 with a woman in a sharp gray suit. Brittany shook my hand and got straight to business. She said this case was now bigger than just the criminal accusations against Caleb. This was about custody of Gigi, about protecting her from her own mother's manipulation. We were walking a tightrope, trying to clear Caleb while also protecting a 6-year-old from more trauma. The hearing started at 2 that afternoon. I sat in the courtroom watching the prosecutor lay out the case against Caleb, talking about Gigi's disclosure, the medical evidence, the detailed statements. The prosecutor seemed confident, like this was routine. Then Lucas stood up and asked to approach the bench. He handed the judge a tablet with the coaching video queued up. I watched the judge's face as she watched that video. Her expression shifted from bored routine to sharp attention. She watched it twice, then looked up at Lucas with different eyes. The judge called an immediate halt to the proceedings. She demanded that Rick Wallace, the CPS investigator, explain how this footage wasn't discovered during his investigation. Rick stood up, looking completely blindsided. He admitted they had only reviewed footage that Laura voluntarily provided. Laura had given them clips from Tuesday night showing Caleb and Gigi playing video games, but she hadn't given them anything from the 2 weeks before. Laura's attorney jumped up trying to argue that the footage was inadmissible, that it was taken out of context, that Laura was just trying to help Gigi articulate trauma she had experienced. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. She ordered a complete forensic analysis of all home security footage. She also ordered that Gigi be evaluated by an independent psychologist, not the one Laura had already taken her to. The judge said Caleb could be released to my custody that afternoon with an ankle monitor while the investigation continued. I nearly collapsed with relief. But when they brought Caleb out, I barely recognized him. He had only been in detention for 2 days, but he looked like he had aged years. His eyes were empty, and he wouldn't look at me. When I tried to hug him, he flinched away like I might hurt him. The counselor at the detention center pulled me aside and said Caleb had been showing signs of serious trauma, that he needed immediate therapy. I signed all the release papers and led Caleb to my car. He didn't say a single word. He just stared out the window with dead eyes, and I realized that even though I had proof of his innocence, something inside my son had broken in that place. The drive home took 20 minutes but felt like hours. Caleb sat in the passenger seat staring out the window without blinking, his hands clenched in his lap so tight his knuckles turned white. I tried talking to him twice, but he didn't respond, didn't even look at me, just kept staring at nothing like he wasn't really there anymore. When we pulled into the driveway, he got out before I turned off the engine and walked straight to the front door, waiting there with his shoulders hunched until I unlocked it. The house looked exactly the same as when we left for the courthouse, but it felt different now, like walking into a place where something terrible happened. Caleb went directly upstairs to his room and closed the door without saying a word. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening for any sound, but heard nothing, not even footsteps or the bed creaking. The detention counselor had pulled me aside before we left and told me Caleb showed signs of severe trauma response, that he needed immediate professional help and constant monitoring for the next few days. She said kids who go through false accusations in detention often develop symptoms similar to torture victims because the psychological damage is that intense. I needed to make sure he was physically safe first, that he knew I believed him completely. I went upstairs and knocked on his door but got no answer. I opened it slowly and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, still in the same position, like a statue. I sat down next to him and told him I knew he didn't do anything, that I had proof Laura made the whole thing up, that we were going to fix this. He didn't look at me or respond, but after a minute, his hand moved slightly toward mine, not quite touching, but close enough that I knew he heard me. That evening around 7, my phone rang with Lucas's number. He told me the judge issued a temporary protection order barring Laura from any contact with Caleb or Gigi while the investigation continued. Gigi had been placed in emergency foster care that afternoon because CPS determined Laura posed a psychological danger to her own daughter. The system that had nearly destroyed my son was now protecting Laura's little girl from her mother, and I didn't know whether to feel relieved or sick about it. Lucas said the foster family was experienced with trauma cases, and Gigi would be safe there, but hearing that a 6-year-old got ripped away from everything she knew because her mother used her as a weapon made my stomach turn. I asked if we could visit her, and Lucas said not yet, that Gigi needed time to decompress without any adults from her previous life around her. The guardian ad litem assigned to her case would evaluate the situation in a few days and decide what contact was appropriate. I thanked Lucas and hung up, then went back upstairs to check on Caleb. He was lying on his bed now, but still fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. I told him about Gigi being in foster care, and he closed his eyes but didn't say anything. The next morning, Rick Wallace showed up at my door at 9. His whole attitude was different from when he first came to take Caleb away. He looked uncomfortable, kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, and actually apologized before coming inside. We sat at the kitchen table and he pulled out a notebook, saying he needed to go through everything again from the beginning. He admitted CPS made serious mistakes by accepting Laura's story without doing independent verification of the evidence. The coaching video suggested something much darker than a concerned mother, possibly Munchausen by proxy, or factitious disorder imposed on another, which meant Laura might have been making Gigi sick or injured on purpose to get attention. He asked me to walk him through the entire timeline again, everything I remembered about Laura's behavior leading up to the accusation. I started talking, and once I got going, things I hadn't even thought about before came flooding back. I told Rick about the past 6 months and how Laura became obsessed with our life insurance policies. She kept asking me to increase the coverage amounts, saying we needed more protection for the family. She pulled out all our retirement account statements and studied them for hours, asking detailed questions about what would happen to the money if something happened to me or Caleb. She wanted to know exactly how inheritance worked, who would get what if Caleb died before turning 18, whether stepchildren had the same rights as biological children. At the time, I thought she was just being practical, maybe worried about our future, but now every conversation took on a sinister edge. I told Rick about how she kept bringing up worst-case scenarios, asking what would happen to my assets if Caleb got in serious legal trouble or had to go to prison. Rick's expression changed as I talked, his jaw getting tighter, and he started writing faster in his notebook. When I finished, he looked up and said, I had just given him motive. Laura wasn't just trying to get Caleb out of the house. She was positioning herself to benefit financially from destroying him. 2 days later, Lucas called and said he was bringing someone to the house, a forensic video analyst who specialized in authenticating digital evidence. The analyst showed up with a laptop and several external drives, spending 3 hours examining every file in our cloud backup system. She confirmed the nanny cam footage showing Laura coaching Gigi was completely authentic and unedited, with metadata proving it was recorded exactly 2 weeks before Gigi made her disclosure at the school. But she found something else that made the case even stronger. Laura had accessed the cloud system the morning of the accusation, right after Gigi went to the school, and deleted multiple video files from the weeks before. The analyst recovered some of the deleted footage and found 2 more instances of Laura coaching Gigi, asking her leading questions about Caleb and correcting her when she said nothing bad happened. Laura had been building this false accusation for weeks, systematically planting the story in her daughter's mind and deleting evidence of her manipulation. That same afternoon, Brittany came over with a stack of legal documents. She was filing an emergency custody motion for Gigi on my behalf, arguing that Laura was psychologically abusing her daughter by using her as a weapon in what appeared to be a scheme to eliminate Caleb from the family and possibly profit from his destruction. The motion included screenshots from the coaching videos, transcripts of the deleted footage, and copies of all Laura's financial inquiries about insurance policies and inheritance laws. Brittany explained this was a long shot because I was only Gigi's stepfather, not her biological parent, but the evidence of Laura's manipulation was so strong that a judge might grant temporary custody while the criminal case moved forward. She said Laura's family would fight it hard, probably trying to get Gigi placed with her grandmother instead, but we had to try because leaving Gigi in the foster system long-term wasn't good for her either. I finally got Caleb an appointment with a trauma therapist who specialized in false accusation cases. The therapist's office was in a quiet building downtown, and the waiting room had comfortable chairs and calm music playing. Caleb barely looked up during the entire intake process, just nodded or shook his head when asked direct questions. I waited outside during the session, pacing the hallway for 50 minutes until the door opened. The therapist asked to speak with me privately and explained that Caleb's symptoms were consistent with someone who experienced severe psychological torture. Being falsely accused of something so horrible and then locked up with actual criminals while everyone assumed you were guilty created trauma that was incredibly difficult to process. She said Caleb would need intensive therapy multiple times a week for months, possibly years, and even then he might never fully recover from what Laura did to him. She gave me warning signs to watch for and told me to call her immediately if Caleb showed any indication of wanting to hurt himself. 3 days after Caleb's release, Detective Jack Floyd came to the house in the evening. He stood on the porch looking uncomfortable and asked if he could come in to talk. We sat in the living room, and he apologized for not investigating more thoroughly before Caleb was removed from the home. He said Laura was extremely convincing when she came to the station, crying and showing him documentation from a doctor about Gigi's injuries that seemed to back up her story. She had medical records, photos of bruises, and Gigi's own statement that was so detailed it seemed impossible for a 6-year-old to make up. He admitted he took Laura at face value because mothers reporting abuse usually tell the truth, and he failed to consider that Laura herself might be the one who hurt Gigi. Jack pulled out his own notebook and said they were now investigating how Gigi got those injuries because the timeline didn't match Laura's claims at all. The medical examiner who reviewed the original photos determined the bruises were at least 4 days old when they were photographed. meaning they happened before Tuesday when Caleb allegedly touched Gigi. Laura had claimed the injuries were fresh from Tuesday night, but the evidence showed Gigi was already hurt days earlier. They were looking into whether Laura caused those injuries herself to make the accusation more believable. Jack said if they could prove Laura deliberately hurt her own daughter to frame Caleb, she would face additional charges of child abuse on top of the false reporting. Lucas called me the next week with another breakthrough. He got access to Laura's phone records through a subpoena and discovered she called her mother Valerie 17 times in the 2 weeks before the accusation. Most of the calls lasted 20 to 40 minutes, way longer than their usual quick check-ins. When investigators went to interview Valerie about the calls, she got nervous and defensive, claiming she and Laura were just talking about normal family stuff. But under pressure, she accidentally let something slip, saying Laura had told her about the plan to get Caleb out of the house. The detective conducting the interview immediately focused on that phrase, and Valerie realized her mistake. She tried to backtrack and say she meant Laura's plan to send Caleb to college early, but it was too late. The detective pushed harder, and Valerie finally admitted Laura had told her weeks before the accusation that she was going to make sure Caleb couldn't interfere with their family anymore. Valerie claimed she didn't know Laura meant false accusations, that she thought Laura was just talking about setting stricter boundaries, but her statement gave prosecutors direct evidence of premeditation. Lucas called me 2 days after Valerie's interview to say the court ordered an independent evaluation of Gigi by a forensic psychologist named Madeline Ingram, who specialized in child testimony cases. Madeline had worked hundreds of abuse investigations and could spot coach disclosure better than anyone in the state. The evaluation happened at a neutral office with soft lighting and toys scattered around to make kids comfortable. I wasn't allowed in the room, but watched through a one-way mirror while Madeline talked to Gigi for 90 minutes. Gigi kept using phrases no 6-year-old would naturally say, words like inappropriate contact and private areas that sounded rehearsed. When Madeline asked her to describe what happened in her own words, instead of repeating what she'd been told, Gigi got confused and mixed up details. At one point, Gigi actually stopped mid-sentence and asked if she said it right, like she was performing lines she'd memorized. Madeline took notes constantly, and her expression stayed neutral, but I could tell she was seeing exactly what I feared. The evaluation report came 3 days later, and I read it alone in Lucas's office while he watched my face. Madeline wrote that Gigi's disclosure contained every classic marker of coached testimony, including adult vocabulary, rehearsed phrasing, lack of sensory details, and confusion when asked to elaborate beyond scripted responses. The report said Gigi appeared to be repeating a story she'd been taught, rather than recalling actual events she experienced. What destroyed me most was Madeline's conclusion that Gigi was a victim too, manipulated by her own mother into becoming a weapon against an innocent teenager. The report recommended intensive therapy for Gigi to help her understand she wasn't in trouble and to undo the psychological damage Laura caused by forcing her to lie. I sat there holding those pages and felt sick knowing Laura had hurt both kids, turning Gigi into an accomplice in destroying Caleb's life. Lucas let me sit quietly for a while before explaining the report would be crucial evidence, but we needed to move carefully because Laura's attorney would attack Madeline's credentials and methodology. 2 days after the report came through, Laura's attorney contacted Lucas trying to negotiate some kind of deal. The attorney suggested maybe Laura was confused or misunderstood what she saw, that perhaps this was all a terrible mistake born from maternal protectiveness gone wrong. Lucas shut that down immediately and told the attorney the coaching video showed clear premeditation and deliberate manipulation of a child. We were pursuing full criminal charges against Laura for false reporting, child endangerment, and child abuse. There would be no deal, no reduction, no sympathy for someone who weaponized the legal system and her own daughter to destroy a teenage boy. That evening, I had to sit Caleb down and explain why Gigi wasn't coming home and why his stepmother was being criminally investigated. He listened without speaking, his face blank, like he'd learned to shut down his emotions to protect himself. When I finished explaining everything, he asked quietly if everyone at the school knew what he'd been accused of. My chest felt tight when I had to tell him yes, that the accusation had spread through his school within hours, and everyone knew the details. He nodded slowly and went to his room without another word. The next week brought a new torture when Caleb's college acceptance letters started arriving in thick envelopes with congratulations printed on the outside. His dream school sent their acceptance with a merit scholarship offer. I put the letters on the kitchen table where he'd see them, but he walked past them every day without looking. His therapist told me Caleb said he didn't deserve to go to college after being accused of something so horrible, that even though he was innocent, the accusation made him feel dirty and worthless. Meanwhile, Brittany called with bad news about the custody case. She explained that even with the coaching video and Madeline's report, getting custody of Gigi would be complicated because I was her stepfather, not biological parent. Laura's family was already filing motions claiming I had no legal standing to seek custody and pushing for Gigi to be placed with Valerie instead. Brittany said we'd fight it, but the legal reality was that step-parents had limited rights compared to blood relatives. The prosecutor assigned to Laura's case asked to meet with me to discuss the criminal charges they were building. She was a woman in her 40s who'd spent 20 years prosecuting child abuse cases, and she looked genuinely angry about what Laura had done. She explained they were charging Laura with filing a false police report, child endangerment for coaching Gigi, and potentially fraud if they could prove financial motive behind the scheme. Each charge carried serious prison time, and the prosecutor intended to push for maximum sentences on all counts. She said cases like this made her furious because real abuse victims got questioned more harshly because of people like Laura who lied. A week later, I got permission to visit Gigi at her foster placement with supervision from her guardian ad litem. The foster home was clean and warm, but Gigi looked small and lost, sitting on their couch clutching a stuffed rabbit. She seemed confused about why she couldn't see her mommy and kept asking when she could go home. Then she looked at me with those big eyes and asked if Caleb was mad at her. I had to swallow hard and reassure her that none of this was her fault, that Caleb loved her and wasn't angry at all. The guardian ad litem sat nearby taking notes on everything we said. About 20 minutes into the visit, Gigi suddenly said something that made everyone in the room freeze. She said Mommy told her what to say, but she didn't remember if it really happened anymore. The guardian ad litem immediately wrote down her exact words, while I tried to keep my expression calm for Gigi's sake. That spontaneous statement became crucial evidence that even Gigi herself was uncertain about the accusations her mother coached her to make. The visit ended shortly after, and I drove home feeling gutted that this little girl was so confused and hurt by her own mother's manipulation. Lucas called me that night with another discovery that made everything even worse. He'd gotten access to Laura's financial records through the investigation and found something shocking. 6 months ago, Laura took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Caleb without my knowledge or consent, listing herself as the beneficiary. Lucas contacted the insurance company and they confirmed Laura had called them multiple times over the past months, asking detailed questions about payout procedures if something happened to Caleb before he turned 18. She'd asked specifically about whether beneficiaries received payment if the insured person died in juvenile detention or prison. The insurance company representative remembered the calls because they seemed unusual and suspicious, but they had no legal grounds to deny the policy at the time. Lucas said this was the proof of financial motive prosecutors needed to upgrade charges against Laura to attempted fraud and possibly conspiracy to commit murder if they could prove she intended for Caleb to die in detention. I hung up with Lucas and just sat there staring at my phone screen for, I don't know how long, $500,000. Laura had bet $500,000 on my son dying or rotting in prison. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped the phone. I picked it up and went to the bathroom and threw up again, same as when I'd found the coaching video. This wasn't just about destroying Caleb's life or getting him out of the house. She wanted him dead. The insurance company representative's notes said Laura asked specifically about payouts if something happened in detention, not if he got sick, not if there was an accident, if something happened in detention, where kids get beaten up or worse every single day. I walked out of the bathroom and Caleb was standing in the hallway. His face told me he'd heard everything. He'd been upstairs the whole time I was on the phone with Lucas, and our house had thin walls. He looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like something inside him just broke completely. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then he started screaming. Not words, just this raw sound that came from somewhere deep. He grabbed his hair with both fists and pulled hard enough that I thought he'd rip it out. I moved toward him, but he backed away fast, hitting the wall. He was saying Laura tried to kill him. She literally tried to murder him through the system. She wanted him to die in that place. His voice got higher and more frantic with each word. I tried to calm him down, but he wasn't hearing me anymore. He slid down the wall to the floor and curled up, rocking back and forth. I called his therapist immediately. She answered, and I explained what happened, how Caleb overheard about the insurance policy and was having a complete breakdown. She said she'd come right over, told me to stay with him, but give him space, don't try to touch him. 20 minutes later, she arrived and found us both sitting on the hallway floor. Caleb was still rocking, making this low sound in his throat. She sat down across from him and started talking in this really calm voice. It took almost an hour before he could even look at her. She asked him questions, and he answered in whispers. Was he thinking about hurting himself? Yes. Did he have a plan? No, but he wanted to stop existing. Did he feel safe at home? He didn't know. The therapist looked at me and said, We needed to go to the hospital. Caleb needed to be somewhere safe where people could watch him all the time. She said the words, psychiatric facility, and I watched Caleb's face crumble. He thought he was locked up again. She explained it wasn't like detention. It was a hospital where they help people who are having thoughts about hurting themselves. He'd stay for 72 hours, and then we'd see how he was doing. Caleb didn't fight it. That scared me more than anything, how he just nodded and stood up like he didn't care what happened to him anymore. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. We drove to the facility in silence. The therapist followed in her own car. The place looked like a regular hospital from outside, but inside everything was locked. They had to buzz us through 3 different doors. The intake nurse asked Caleb a bunch of questions while I filled out paperwork. They took his shoelaces and his belt. They checked his pockets and went through his bag. Then a counselor came and said it was time for me to leave, that Caleb needed to get settled in. I tried to hug him, but he just stood there stiff. He wouldn't look at me. A staff member led him through another locked door, and he was gone. I made it to my car before I completely lost it. I sat in that parking lot sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. My innocent son was in a psychiatric hospital because his stepmother had tried to have him killed for money. Laura was out on bail, probably at her mother's house, while Caleb was locked behind 3 different doors being watched to make sure he didn't hurt himself. The next morning, Brittany called. Laura's attorney had filed a motion claiming I was an unfit parent. The motion said I'd allowed my son to become so unstable he needed psychiatric hospitalization, which proved I couldn't provide adequate care. They were using Caleb's trauma response against us. Brittany said it was one of the most cynical legal moves she'd ever seen in 20 years of family law. They were literally arguing that the damage Laura caused by falsely accusing him meant I shouldn't have custody of Gigi. I asked if it would work. She said probably not given all the evidence against Laura, but it would make the custody case messier and more expensive. That same week, Madeline finished her evaluation of Gigi. She submitted a formal report to the court that I got to read through Brittany. The report said Gigi showed clear signs of emotional abuse from being used as a tool in her mother's scheme. Madeline wrote that Gigi displayed confusion about reality versus what she'd been told to say, anxiety about disappointing her mother, and fear of getting in trouble for telling the truth. She recommended Gigi have 0 contact with Laura until Laura completed extensive psychological treatment and possibly never unsupervised contact again. The report was brutal in its assessment of what Laura had done to her own daughter. A few days later, Rick called me. His investigation was complete, and he was issuing his final report. He read parts of it to me over the phone. The report completely cleared Caleb of any wrongdoing and recommended Laura's parental rights to Gigi be terminated immediately. Rick had documented how Laura systematically manipulated the child protection system to weaponize it against an innocent teenager. He'd found her internet search history showing she'd researched false accusations, coaching techniques, and how CPS investigations worked. She'd planned everything carefully. Rick apologized again for not catching it sooner, said the system had failed Caleb, and he'd make sure the protocols changed. On the 3rd day, I got to visit Caleb at the facility. They led me to a common room with plastic chairs and motivational posters on the walls. Caleb came in looking smaller somehow, wearing hospital scrubs. He had dark circles under his eyes. We sat down, and I asked how he was doing. He said the medication helped, that he could sleep now without seeing Laura's face or hearing the detention center doors slam. His voice was flat, but he was talking in complete sentences again. The therapist had worked with him on a safety plan for when he got out. He had to promise to tell someone if he started having thoughts about hurting himself. He had to agree to intensive outpatient therapy 3 times a week. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me he wanted to testify against Laura if it meant protecting Gigi from being used like that again. He said Gigi shouldn't have to grow up thinking what happened was her fault. His eyes had this determined look I hadn't seen since before the accusation. Lucas called that evening with news about the criminal trial. The date was set for 3 months out. He warned me it would be brutal because Laura's defense attorney would try to paint her as a concerned mother who made a mistake. We needed to be ready for her to claim mental illness, or that she actually believed something had happened to Gigi. Lucas said the coaching video was powerful evidence, but juries could be unpredictable, especially with mothers accused of harming their children. We had to prepare for every possible defense strategy. I met with Brittany the next week to discuss adopting Gigi. She explained it would be complicated because I was only her stepfather, not biological parent. I'd need to prove Laura was unfit, and that I could provide a stable home. Given the circumstances with Caleb's hospitalization, Laura's attorney would fight it hard. Brittany said it was a long shot, but worth pursuing because it would give me legal standing in the custody case. We started gathering documents and character references. Caleb came home 5 days after admission with a thick packet of discharge papers and a schedule for outpatient therapy. He looked better, more present in his eyes, The medication had helped stabilize his mood. He went straight to his room and I heard him moving things around. An hour later, he came downstairs with a stack of envelopes, college acceptance letters he'd been ignoring for weeks. He asked if I'd help him write to the schools explaining what happened and requesting to defer enrollment for a year. We spent that evening drafting emails together. He was honest about the false accusation, the evidence that cleared him and his need for time to heal. We sent them to 5 different schools. Over the next 2 weeks, all 5 responded. Every single one agreed to hold his spot and expressed compassion for what he'd been through. One admissions counselor wrote that his strength in surviving such an ordeal proved he had the character they wanted in their students. 3 days after the last college acceptance came through, I heard someone pounding on my front door at 7 in the morning. I looked through the peephole and saw Valerie standing there with her face twisted in rage. I pulled out my phone and started recording before I opened the door, keeping the chain lock on. She immediately started screaming that I was a monster who destroyed her daughter's life, that I turned Laura into something evil just to protect my perverted son. Her face was red and spit was flying as she demanded I bring Gigi out right now because she had more right to that child than I did. I kept my phone aimed at her and stayed calm, telling her Gigi wasn't here and she needed to leave my property. That's when she started making threats, saying she knew people who could make sure I never got custody, that she'd make my life hell in court, that Caleb better watch his back because karma was coming for him. She went on for almost 10 minutes while I recorded every word. When she finally left, I immediately sent the video to Lucas and Brittany. Lucas called back within an hour saying this was exactly what we needed for a restraining order, and he'd file the paperwork that afternoon. By the end of the week, the judge granted a temporary restraining order that covered not just Valerie, but all of Laura's immediate family, keeping them at least 500 feet away from me, Caleb, and Gigi. Lucas called me 2 weeks later with news about the criminal case. The prosecutor had offered Laura a plea deal, 15 years with possibility of parole after serving at least 10, in exchange for pleading guilty to all charges and giving up her parental rights to Gigi permanently. Lucas said Laura was actually thinking about taking it because the evidence against her was so strong that going to trial meant risking 25 years or more. The coaching video was damning. The life insurance policy showed clear motive, and Gigi's own statements to the forensic psychologist proved the manipulation. Lucas warned me not to get my hopes up, though, because Laura's personality type often couldn't accept defeat, even when it was the smart choice. He said people like her sometimes convinced themselves they could charm a jury, or that their version of events would somehow win out, despite overwhelming evidence. I asked what would happen to Gigi if Laura took the deal, and Lucas said it would make my adoption case much easier since there'd be no contested custody battle. We'd still need to go through the process, but Laura's signed termination of rights would remove the biggest obstacle. 2 days later, Lucas called again. Laura had rejected the plea deal. Her attorney apparently convinced her that they could argue she genuinely believed something happened to Gigi, and the coaching video just showed her trying to help Gigi articulate real trauma she'd experienced. They planned to bring in expert witnesses who would testify about how mothers sometimes use leading questions when they suspect abuse, and that Laura's actions came from a place of protective instinct rather than malicious intent. Lucas said it was a weak defense, but juries could be unpredictable, especially when a mother was on trial. He warned me the trial would be brutal because they'd try to paint Caleb as suspicious and me as a father in denial. We needed to be ready for them to twist everything, to make Laura look like a concerned parent who made mistakes, rather than someone who deliberately tried to destroy a teenage boy's life for money. Meanwhile, Gigi's therapy was making real progress. Her therapist called to tell me Gigi had finally been able to put into words what happened with Laura. During their session, Gigi said that her mommy told her to say things that weren't true about Caleb, that mommy practiced the words with her over and over until she could say them right. The therapist was documenting everything carefully because Gigi's own articulation of the coaching would be powerful evidence when Laura went to trial. She explained that having the child victim directly state she was manipulated was rare and incredibly important for the case. Gigi was also starting to understand that what happened wasn't her fault, that she was too little to know her mommy was doing something wrong. The therapist said Gigi still had guilt about Caleb getting in trouble, but she was working through it and making good progress toward healing. The guardian ad litem called me in for a meeting the following week. She told me Gigi had been asking about Caleb constantly during her supervised visits, wanting to know if he was okay and if he was mad at her. Gigi apparently cried during one visit saying she missed her big brother and wanted to say sorry for the bad things she said. The guardian thought a supervised visit between them might actually help both kids heal, as long as we did it carefully with a therapist present. We set it up for the next Saturday at the family court building in a room designed for supervised contact. I was nervous about how Caleb would react, because he'd been so fragile since everything happened, but his therapist thought it might actually give him closure to see that Gigi was okay and didn't blame him. The day of the visit, I drove Caleb to the courthouse, and we sat in the waiting room until they called us back. Gigi was already in the room with her foster mother and the supervising therapist when we walked in. The second Gigi saw Caleb, she burst into tears and ran across the room to him. Caleb dropped to his knees and she threw her arms around his neck, sobbing that she was sorry, so sorry for saying those things that weren't true. Caleb was crying too, holding her and telling her over and over that he knew it wasn't her fault, that he wasn't mad at her, that he loved her, and always would. They sat on the floor together for almost 20 minutes while Gigi cried, and Caleb just held her, rocking her gently like he used to when she had nightmares. The therapist told me later that this was exactly what both of them needed, that Gigi's relief at knowing Caleb didn't hate her was visible in her whole body, and that Caleb seemed to find some kind of purpose in protecting his little sister from further harm. His own therapist later said that helping Gigi might actually speed up his healing because it gave him a way to reclaim power in a situation where he'd been completely powerless. 8 weeks before the trial date, Lucas got another call from Laura's attorney. They were coming back with a better offer. Laura would plead guilty to all charges, accept 20 years in prison, give up all parental rights to Gigi, and provide a full written confession detailing her financial motive and exactly how she coached Gigi. The attorney admitted that Laura had finally realized she was going to prison no matter what and wanted some control over the outcome rather than risking an even longer sentence at trial. Lucas said this was the best possible result for us because it meant Gigi wouldn't have to testify, Caleb wouldn't have to relive everything in court, and we'd have Laura's own confession to use in therapy to help Gigi understand what her mother did to her. Lucas and the prosecutor spent the next 2 weeks hammering out the final terms. The plea deal would include Laura making a recorded video statement explaining in detail how she coached Gigi, showing Gigi where to say Caleb touched her, telling her what words to use, and practicing the story until Gigi could recite it convincingly. Laura would also have to explain on camera that her motive was the life insurance policy on Caleb, that she planned to have him imprisoned or killed so she could collect the money. The statement would be used in Gigi's therapy to help her process what happened and understand that her mother manipulated her. It would also be part of the permanent court record in case Laura ever tried to claim she was coerced into the plea. Lucas said having Laura's confession on video was insurance against her changing her story later or trying to contact Gigi despite the no-contact order. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in late September. I sat in the courtroom with Caleb beside me, both of us dressed in suits, watching Laura walk in wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked smaller somehow, deflated, like something inside her had finally broken. The judge asked her a series of questions to make sure she understood what she was pleading guilty to and the consequences. Laura answered each question in this flat, mechanical voice, never looking toward where Caleb and I sat. When the judge asked her to allocate, to explain in her own words what she did, Laura recited her crimes like she was reading items off a shopping list. She admitted coaching Gigi to make false accusations against Caleb. She admitted her motive was financial gain from the life insurance policy. She admitted manipulating the medical evidence and lying to investigators. She admitted using her own daughter as a weapon to destroy an innocent teenager's life. Through all of it, her voice never changed tone, never showed emotion, like she was talking about someone else's actions instead of her own. The judge accepted the plea without hesitation and moved directly to sentencing. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence, read the victim impact statements from both Caleb and Gigi's therapists, and considered the serious nature of Laura's crimes. She called what Laura did a calculated attack on a child using the systems meant to protect children, and said it represented one of the most disturbing cases of parental manipulation she'd seen in 20 years on the bench. The judge sentenced Laura to 20 years in state prison, with a strong recommendation that she serve the full term without early release. Then, she terminated Laura's parental rights to Gigi immediately and permanently, stating that Laura had proven herself completely unfit and a danger to her own child's well-being. Finally, she issued a permanent no-contact order that prohibited Laura from any communication with Caleb or Gigi for the rest of their lives, even after her release from prison. Laura's attorney started to object to something, but the judge cut him off, saying there was nothing left to argue, and Laura should consider herself fortunate the prosecutor didn't push for an even longer sentence. The bailiff led Laura out of the courtroom, and she never once looked back at us. Outside the courtroom, Caleb made it maybe 10 steps down the hallway before his legs gave out. He dropped right there on the marble floor, back against the wall, and the sounds that came out of him were something I'd never heard from him before. Not crying exactly, more like his whole body was trying to expel months of poison all at once. His hands shook so bad he couldn't control them, and he kept trying to talk, but the words came out broken and wrong. I got down on the floor next to him and pulled him against my chest while he sobbed that he thought his life was over, that everyone at the school would always think he was a predator, that he'd never be normal again. People walked past us in the courthouse hallway and some stared, but I didn't care. Caleb needed to get this out, needed to release whatever Laura had infected him with during those months of terror. He cried until his throat was raw and his face was red and swollen, and I just held him and told him it was over now. She couldn't hurt him anymore. Eventually, his breathing slowed down and the shaking stopped, and he wiped his face with his sleeve like he was embarrassed. We sat there on that cold courthouse floor for probably 20 minutes before either of us could stand up. 2 weeks later, I was back in a different courtroom for the custody hearing. Laura's mother, Valerie, showed up with her own attorney, arguing that I had no biological connection to Gigi and she should go to blood family. The guardian ad litem stood up and presented a thick report about Gigi's attachment to me and Caleb, all the progress she'd made in therapy, the stable home environment I could provide. Gigi's therapist testified about how Gigi talked about me as her dad and asked about coming home constantly. The judge reviewed all the evidence, looked at Valerie's history of enabling Laura's behavior, and made her decision in less than 5 minutes. She granted me full legal custody of Gigi, effective immediately, terminated any visitation rights for Laura's family, and signed the papers right there. Gigi officially became my daughter. Valerie screamed something about this being wrong as the bailiff escorted her out, but the judge just moved on to the next case like it was already forgotten. I walked out of that courtroom with legal papers that said Gigi was mine to protect, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. Bringing Gigi home 3 days later was harder than I expected. She bounced around the house excited to see her room again, but then she'd go quiet and ask when Mommy was coming back. Her therapist had prepared me for this, told me Gigi would grieve the mother she thought she had, even while adjusting to safety. We established routines like the therapist suggested, same breakfast time every day, same bedtime ritual, predictable structure to help her feel secure. Caleb surprised everyone by being incredibly patient and gentle with her. He'd sit on the floor playing dolls with her for hours, letting her direct everything, never showing frustration when she asked the same questions over and over. One night I found him reading to her at bedtime, doing all the character voices, and Gigi was giggling in a way I hadn't heard since before everything happened. He caught me watching and just shrugged, but I could see something had shifted in him. Taking care of Gigi was helping him heal too. A week after Gigi came home, Caleb told me he'd decided to take a gap year before college. He said he needed time to get his head right, to help Gigi adjust, to figure out who he was after everything Laura did to him. I wanted to argue that he shouldn't let this derail his future, but his therapist said it was actually a healthy decision, that he was recognizing his limits and prioritizing healing. Caleb got a part-time job at a bookstore downtown, stocking shelves and helping customers find books. He came home after his first shift, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months, said it felt good to do something normal where nobody knew his story. He kept going to intensive therapy twice a week, working through the trauma bit by bit. Some days were harder than others, days where he barely got out of bed, but slowly, I could see him rebuilding the sense of self that Laura tried to destroy. He started talking about the future again, making plans, believing he had a life ahead of him. 6 months after Laura's sentencing, Caleb's therapist called me in for a joint session to discuss his progress. She said Caleb had made remarkable strides in processing the trauma and was ready to reduce therapy to weekly sessions instead of twice a week. During the session, Caleb admitted he still had nightmares about detention sometimes, still woke up in a panic thinking he was back in that cell, but the nightmares were less frequent now, maybe once a week instead of every night, and he could usually calm himself down without spiraling. He said he was starting to believe he actually had a future again, that he could go to college next year and maybe have a normal life. The therapist warned us that trauma recovery isn't linear, that there would still be hard days, but Caleb had developed good coping skills and a strong support system. Watching him talk about his progress with something like hope in his voice made me realize how close we'd come to losing him completely. Around the same time, Gigi's therapist sent me a progress report that brought tears to my eyes. She wrote that Gigi was thriving in her new environment, showing resilience that was remarkable for a child who'd been through so much manipulation. Gigi rarely asked about Laura anymore, and when she did, it was factual questions rather than emotional ones, like she was asking about a character in a story rather than her mother. The report detailed how Gigi had formed a strong, healthy bond with Caleb, how she saw him as a protective older brother now, instead of the monster her mother tried to make her fear. The therapist included drawings Gigi had made of our family, pictures of the three of us together with big smiles, and in every single drawing she'd written, "My family," across the top in crayon. The therapist recommended we could start spacing out Gigi's sessions too, moving from weekly to every other week. She said Gigi had processed the trauma as much as a 6-year-old could, and now just needed stability and love to continue healing. I started my own therapy around then, because I finally admitted I needed help processing everything. I'd been so focused on getting Caleb and Gigi through this that I hadn't dealt with my own trauma from watching my wife try to destroy my son. My therapist was this older woman who'd seen everything and didn't judge me for missing the signs. She helped me understand that I'd missed red flags because I trusted Laura completely, that I'd loved her and believed in our marriage, and that trust wasn't a weakness, even though she exploited it. We worked through my guilt about not protecting Caleb sooner, about bringing Laura into our lives in the first place. The therapist said I couldn't have known, that manipulators are skilled at hiding their true nature, that I'd done everything right once I discovered the truth. It helped to hear that, even if I didn't fully believe it yet. The sessions gave me space to be angry and hurt and confused, without having to stay strong for my kids. About 8 months after the sentencing, Caleb told me he'd gotten involved with an organization that supports people who've been falsely accused of crimes. They'd reached out to him after seeing news coverage of Laura's case, asking if he'd be willing to share his story to help others navigate the psychological aftermath. At first, I worried it was too soon, that he wasn't ready to relive everything publicly. But Caleb said talking about it with people who understood actually helped him feel less alone. He started doing video calls with other teenagers who'd been falsely accused, sharing strategies for coping with the trauma and rebuilding trust in the system. He told me that turning his nightmare into something that could help people made it feel less meaningless, like maybe there was a reason he had to go through it. I watched him on one of these calls once, saw how patient and compassionate he was with a kid who was where he'd been months ago, and I felt proud of the person he was becoming, despite everything Laura did to him. I got a letter from the life insurance company about 9 months after Laura's arrest. They were refunding every premium Laura had paid on that policy she'd taken out on Caleb, with interest. The letter explained they'd flagged Laura in their system, so she could never take out policies on anyone again, not just with their company, but industry-wide. They were also implementing new safeguards to prevent similar schemes after our case exposed serious holes in their verification process. Now they required in-person interviews with all parties before issuing policies on minors, mandatory checks for any previous fraud investigations, and automatic flags if someone tried to take out multiple large policies in a short time. The claims director called me personally to apologize for not catching Laura's suspicious behavior earlier. He said our case had changed how they operated and might prevent other families from going through what we did. I deposited the refund check into Caleb's college fund, figuring that was the best way to use money that came from Laura's evil plan. Gigi started kindergarten that fall in our neighborhood school, with nobody knowing anything about her history. I'd met with the principal and her teacher privately to explain she'd been through trauma, but was doing well in therapy, without giving specific details. They agreed to watch for any signs she was struggling, but treat her like any other student. Gigi made friends easily right from the first day, coming home chattering about kids named Jana and Zoe and Danilo, who she played with at recess. Her teacher sent home glowing reports about how bright and happy she was, how she participated in class and helped other kids who were struggling. At the first parent-teacher conference, the teacher told me Gigi showed no signs of trauma or behavioral issues, that she was just a normal, well-adjusted kindergartner who loved art class and story time. Watching Gigi thrive with this fresh start, seeing her make friends and learn and just be a regular kid, felt like the best possible outcome after everything she'd been through. That spring, Caleb started working on college applications again for the following fall semester. He sat at the kitchen table for hours with his laptop, typing and deleting and retyping his admission essay. I asked him what he was writing about, and he said he was telling his story, the whole nightmare of being falsely accused and how he survived it. His college counselor called me a week later and said she'd never read anything so powerful in 20 years of reviewing essays, that Caleb's writing showed incredible strength and self-awareness for someone his age. The acceptances started arriving in March, thick envelopes from schools even better than the ones that had accepted him before, including 2 Ivy League programs that specifically mentioned his essay in their acceptance letters. Caleb opened each one carefully, reading the letters out loud to me and Gigi, and I watched him start to believe he actually had a future again. I put the house on the market in April, because none of us could stand living in the place where Laura had destroyed our lives. The realtor said it would sell fast, given the neighborhood, and we got 3 offers within a week. I accepted one from a young couple who had no idea what had happened there, and we closed 30 days later. The new place was 20 minutes away in a different school district, a smaller house but with a big backyard and no traumatic memories soaked into the walls. Gigi got to pick out everything for her new room, and she chose purple paint, purple curtains, and a purple bedspread covered in stars. Caleb spent an entire Saturday helping her paint, both of them getting more paint on themselves than the walls, laughing in a way I hadn't heard since before the accusation. I stood in the doorway watching them work together and felt something release in my chest, like maybe we really were going to be okay. The date that would have been my anniversary with Laura came around in June, and I decided to reclaim it. I took Caleb and Gigi to their favorite restaurant, a place with huge burgers and a dessert menu that made Gigi's eyes go wide. We ordered too much food, and Gigi got a chocolate sundae the size of her head. Caleb raised his water glass and made a toast, saying this family was way better than the old one anyway. Gigi clinked her glass against his and agreed so enthusiastically that water sloshed onto the table. I looked at both of them, at how far we'd come from that horrible morning when CPS knocked on my door, and realized Caleb was right. We'd been through hell, but we'd chosen each other, and that made us stronger than anything Laura tried to break. August came too fast, and suddenly it was time for Caleb to leave for college orientation. He packed his car with boxes and bags, looking nervous but excited in a way I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. Gigi made him a good luck card covered in so much glitter that it left sparkles all over the kitchen counter. She made him promise to video call every Sunday, and he swore he would, crossing his heart and letting her inspect his phone to make sure he had the right app installed. I walked him to his car and hugged him hard, trying not to cry as I told him how proud I was of the person he'd become. He pulled away looking embarrassed but happy, and I watched him drive down our street until his car disappeared around the corner. The kid who'd been broken in juvenile detention was heading off to build his own life, and I felt proud of how far he'd come from those dark days. 2 years after everything started, Gigi's therapist called me in for a final session. She said Gigi had processed the trauma completely and developed healthy coping skills, that she didn't need treatment anymore. Gigi wanted to celebrate being done with therapy, so I let her have a party with her school friends who knew nothing about what she'd survived. 8 little girls ran around our backyard eating cake and playing games, and Gigi glowed with happiness the whole afternoon. Her best friend's mom asked me what we were celebrating, and I just said it was a special day for Gigi, not explaining that we were marking the end of a nightmare her daughter would never have to understand. A letter arrived from the state in September with an official seal on the envelope. Inside was an apology for how CPS had handled our case, acknowledging they'd made serious mistakes by accepting Laura's narrative without proper investigation. The letter explained they'd implemented new protocols because of what happened to us, including mandatory review of all available evidence before removing children from homes and requirements for independent verification of accusations. They'd added extra training for investigators about coaching and factitious disorders. Our nightmare had changed the system and might prevent other families from going through what we did. I filed the letter away, not sure how to feel about being the cautionary tale that fixed a broken system. Caleb came home for Thanksgiving break in November, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. He'd gained back the weight he lost during the accusation, and his eyes had lost that haunted look that used to keep me awake at night. Over dinner, he told us he'd declared a psychology major with a focus on trauma recovery. He wanted to work with people who'd been falsely accused, using his own experience to help others survive what he'd survived. Gigi asked if that meant he was going to be a feelings doctor, and Caleb laughed, saying sort of. He explained that going through something terrible could either destroy you or give you purpose, and he'd decided to turn his nightmare into something that helped people. I watched him talk about his plans with such passion and realized Laura hadn't broken him after all. She'd just shown him what he was strong enough to survive. 2 years after Laura's sentencing, I sat in the audience at Gigi's school play, watching her perform with total confidence. She had a speaking role as a talking tree and delivered every line with enthusiasm, making the other parents laugh. Caleb sat beside me, cheering louder than anyone else when she took her bow, and Gigi spotted us in the crowd and waved so hard she nearly knocked over the kid next to her. After the show, she ran to us, and Caleb lifted her up, spinning her around while she giggled. We weren't the family we were supposed to be, the one I'd imagined when I married Laura. We were something different, something we'd built from the wreckage of her betrayal. We were the family we chose to become, and that choice made us stronger than Laura's lies could ever break. That's it for today's story. I'm really thankful you were here to share it with me. I hope it left you feeling a little lighter.